We are about to resume the session and invite here delegates from the United States of America. Please, delegates, take your seats. Please. Yeah, 5 minutes to speak.
This guy's fork.
No, it's not good.
Okay, we wanted to thank the EU for hosting us here today.
what's
So the
that?
plan we've implemented
check.
largely considers how
Oh,
practical various
okay,
policies are. We wanted to only make changes that we thought would be objectively likely to occur in the coming years and not be impossible to make standard practice. We also want to ensure that none of our policies were inequitable for groups usually negatively affected by pollution-based policies. We chose policies that in combination with each other were effective, obtainable, and reasonable for populations across the world. And to do this, we mostly focus on air pollution reduction strategies.
So, our three main strategies, like we discussed, are reducing carbon emissions, making commitments to reduce deforestation, and then contributing to a global climate fund. So, as pledged, the U.S. will continue to work towards a 26 to 28% reduction in emissions from 2005 to 2025. That's what we pledged before. So this is our going forward pledge. And just like for context, in recent years, U.S. emissions have fallen and they're now 13% below 2005 levels. So we did stick to our pledge that we made before. So going forward, we plan to discourage mining coal and burning it in power plants. Coal is the most harmful fossil fuel in terms of carbon emissions as well as in air pollutants, and they cause severe health impacts. So we plan to reduce emissions by 30%. We're going to discourage drilling, refining, and consuming oil for energy. Oil is a fossil fuel that is used widely in cars, ships, and planes, also in industry, heating, and electricity. And it also has sparked major oil spills, which threatens ecosystems and water. We're going to discourage the use of trees, waste, and agricultural crops to create energy. Bioenergy is energy produced from the burning or combustion of living organic materials as solids, like wood pellets, liquids, ethanols, or gas, which is like methane. And these are a variety of sources which can be worse than burning coal. And then we're going to encourage building solar panels, geothermal energy sources, and wind turbines, because renewable energy is really good for the environment, and also it includes winds, I already said that. And it also includes hydropower and other technologies that produce energy with little to no carbon dioxide emissions or air pollution. We're going to set a global carbon price that makes energy sources more expensive depending on how much carbon dioxide they release. And this will be like kind of it will push people to use clean air, and enact a clean electricity standard or emissions performance standard. And energy producers can pass additional costs to their customers, so policy must be designed to minimize the impacts on the poorest. And we're going to phase this in over the next 30 years, so it's not going to dramatically affect people immediately. It's going to be more of a gradual process. We're going to increase purchases of new electric cars, trucks, buses, and trains, and possibly even ships and airplanes. Using electric motors for transport helps reduce greenhouse gas emissions and air pollution. The electricity is from low carbon sources like solar and wind. Finally, we're going to encourage building nuclear power plants, because nuclear power production, as we learned, does not release carbon dioxide. And just for some context, the outcomes that we expect to see is by the year 2100, our increase in global temperature is going to be at 1.9 degrees Celsius, which is below the 2 degrees Celsius increase that we're all going for. The carbon dioxide concentration we have at 439 parts per million, which is a huge decrease. Sea level rise will be at 0.5 meter, which is very little. And the cumulative avoided carbon dioxide by 2100 will be 3,259 gigatons, which is a lot. So we expect that our policies will be very effective at reducing air pollution.
We are going to make commitments to reduce deforestation and plant new forest areas through afforestation. We pledge to have all of our wood for building materials sourced from forests practicing sustainable forest management. So sustainable forest management practice selective logging, which is a practice of removing certain trees that are old, fallen down, or about to fall down instead of new healthy trees. And then during selective logging, we'll preserve the balance of the woodland by planting new trees in the place of the trees that have already fallen down. So we're just basically managing forests instead of cutting down forests. And then we still need building materials made out of wood, since wood is one of the most sustainable materials. So we're going to use cross-laminated timber, which is a mass timber subsect, and it offers sustainability because cross-laminated timber is made from denser wood. Basically, it's gluing a bunch of timber from the same log together. So it's using less trees, but it's denser so that it can store more carbon during the building's lifetime, and it can also capture additional carbon. Researchers have found that using mid-rise cross-log timber provides 15 to 26% reduction in global warming potential. And then to promote afforestation, when deciding where to plant trees to fight climate change, since trees are such a big carbon sink, the U.S. uses an advanced web-based tool called Reforestation Hub. It allows us to see where we should plant trees to best control floodwaters, improve the livability of our cities, help wildlife adapt to climate change by planting in locations that support climate resilience of plants, animals, and cities that are affected, that are climate refugees. The technology Reforestation Hub is fully developed. It's identified up to 148 million acres of total opportunity for reforestation, which is huge. It's basically the size of California and Washington State put together, and that could capture 535 million metric tons of carbon each year. And we also plan to invest in technology leading to paperless working environments. However, we have some of the largest tech companies in the world. This is more development in the private sector, so it has less to do with the government, but still, these companies are largely powerful and are leading in the paperless direction. Apple, Microsoft, Meta, Intel, IBM, and Dell are all housed in the US. In addition, the government will spend on public school systems so that students have access to computers and tablets, which will stop the abundant use of paper in schools and shrink the inequity gap between the opportunities offered to public school and private school attendees because of the lack of technology in public schools.
And then finally, we will be pledging an annual contribution of $15 billion to the Global Climate Fund. This fund will be aimed at helping developing countries create sustainable infrastructure in the hopes of long-term reduction and avoidance of emissions, and also the ability to adapt to future climate change. The fund will also provide, as we said, much needed aid in cases of natural disasters and refugees. Effective utilization of this fund will be on a country-to-country basis, but will primarily be targeted at each nation's leading sustainable method of production. Additionally, it is of the utmost importance that this fund is allocated at the discretion of its contributors. We understand the needs of developing economies to operate within our regulatory framework, but we do not want it to be something that can be taken advantage of.
In conclusion, the U.S. pledges to reduce carbon emissions as we continue to work towards a 28% reduction in emissions. This will be done through various policy changes, including the taxing of coal and other fossil fuels and the subsidization of renewable energy sources, specifically pushing the wider implementation of nuclear energy. We plan to fight deforestation through the sourcing of building materials from sustainable forests, among other plans, and bolster carbon sequestration through the planting of new forest areas with the help of afforestation practices. And finally, we pledge an annual contribution of $15 billion to a global climate fund to help developing countries create sustainable infrastructure. Through these policies we have mentioned during this proposal, we hope to create a reduced temperature increase from 3.6 degrees Celsius to 1.9 degrees Celsius and lower levels of air pollution while implementing feasible policies and taxes. All in all, the United States is committed to fighting climate change in a just way that allows for sustainable development to continue.
Thank you, U.S. delegates. To you two, I ask to complete this form in order to have a summary of your national contribution. And now, because of geographical proximity, I ask you delegates from the Federal Republic of Brazil to come here and share their national contributions.
I did too.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to the European Union for hosting us all today. With 97% of climate scientists in agreement that the climate change is an immediate issue that we must act on, developed and developing global powers must work together in order to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions and optimize our economic and other national interests alongside the future of our environment. We, Brazil, and the other developing countries of the world are especially at risk of climate change effects such as drought, disease, flooding, decreasing agricultural productivity, and ecological disruption. However, being amongst the poorest countries in the world, we lack the financial resources to effectively invest in clean energy technologies, reduce carbon emissions, or even counter the climate change effects we are facing right now. This is why, while we are ambitious to take immediate action to combat climate change, we cannot do so without the full support of the developed countries of the world. In this presentation, we will introduce the plans we will carry out to reduce carbon emissions and eliminate deforestation if we are granted the financial support of the developed countries of the world.
So we project our emissions peak year to be 2050, and the reductions to begin in the same year, and our annual reduction rate to be 3.3%. And we need time to build our infrastructure and lift our people out of poverty before we can start reducing our carbon footprint. This is because we rely on industries such as manufacturing, construction, and agriculture, which are major contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. Without economic development and growth, it is challenging for us to reduce our carbon emissions while still meeting basic needs for our populations. With the financial support from developed countries, we can hopefully achieve our development goals by around 2050. We can provide funding for sustainable infrastructure, clean energy projects, and other programs that can help reduce greenhouse gas emissions while also promoting economic growth. Some of these actions would include transition to cleaner energy sources such as solar and wind power, and encouraging public transportation, promoting the use of electric vehicles, and implementing energy efficient buildings. This financial support will help us to leapfrog from older, more polluting technologies and move directly more into sustainable options.
As representatives of the developing nations of the world, we are here to propose the actions that we will take to reduce our carbon emissions if we are granted the financial support that we need from developed countries in order to make this happen. Many developed countries have already made pledges to the UN to address climate change. Most of these pledges do not include developed nations reaching peak emissions levels until 2050. Instead, these pledges plan on growing their greenhouse gas emissions at a slower rate until 2050, at which point their emission levels will peak. This is not good enough, and millions of people living in developing countries will suffer if developed countries' emissions continue to grow for another 27 years, as we are the ones who are primarily affected by these emissions. Instead, we urge the developed nations of the world to increase funding and take more significant action in order to help us increase our renewable energy infrastructure so that we can avoid doing potentially irreversible damage to our planet. One of the major sectors in which we have the opportunity to reduce emissions is from deforestation and land degradation. As developing countries contain most of the world's tropical forests, our countries suffer from substantial deforestation. We will now introduce some of the programs we would like to see funded that we believe are crucial in protecting our forests and reducing global emissions.
Developing nations are home to the majority of the world's remaining tropical forests. Protecting these rainforests needs to be prioritized in combating climate change. They are a critical component of the world's global climate system. As the lungs of our Earth, the rainforests absorb much of the carbon dioxide we emit. The Amazon rainforest contains approximately 123 billion tons of carbon, but as deforestation continues, the Amazon is now emitting more carbon dioxide than it is able to take in. In the last 50 years, we have lost 17% of the Amazon rainforest from deforestation. This deforestation is detrimental to the biodiversity that thrive within the rainforest, as well as to the people living in the surrounding region. It is crucial we act now to prevent further deforestation that is contributing to a significant portion of carbon emissions.
We, Brazil, are committed to reducing deforestation in our rainforest. By 2030, we pledge to stop deforestation completely. We will incentivize the implementation of more sustainable farming practices with help from organizations such as the Amazon Fund. Previously, the Amazon Fund has succeeded in reducing deforestation. Between 2004 to 2012, there is an 80% decrease in deforestation. The vast majority of the Amazon Fund is funded by our own nation, as well as the generous nations of Norway and Germany. With help from other developed nations, we can prevent further deforestation in our rainforest, as well as restore the land for Brazil's indigenous people and wildlife that depend on it.
In addition to limiting deforestation, we, Brazil, are committed to the reforestation of the Brazilian rainforest, as well as the promotion of reforestation in the rest of Latin America. By 2050, we plan to restore, or at least have begun to restore, around 50% of the deforested rainforest, assuming that we increase our reforestation rate to 10 million hectares a year, which is a significant change. To do this, we would focus on areas along the southern edges of the Amazon forest, known as Brazil's arc of deforestation, as well as in the heart of the forest, where natural regeneration is still possible. While this seems like a major undertaking, we have a plan to successfully achieve our goal. We will follow a similar model to Costa Rica, who has been at the forefront of reforestation in the past few years. This model is called the Program of Payments for Environmental Services, or PES. The PES system is not a simple but proven principle. The state pays private farmers to protect the forest on their land, with the funding mainly coming from fuel taxes. By using this, we can help to grow our own economy and support our more rural farmers while helping to restore our national forests. By combining the PES model with agroforestry, which mixes trees with croplands, and silvopasture, which combines trees with livestock grazing lands, we can ensure these farmers continue their livelihood while also regrowing the forests as opposed to using degraded farmland. With these efforts, we are confident that we can restore a significant percentage of the forest in our country and set a precedent for other Latin American countries to follow. This will require significant financial and political commitment, as well as significant investments in the necessary infrastructure, including nurseries, seed banks, and transportation networks, so we hope developed countries will come to our aid and we receive the funding we are requesting.
The rich and developed nations of the world must commit to more significant climate action. As representatives of developing countries such as Brazil, we refuse to continue to pay the price for the past mistakes and high emissions of developed countries. The developed nations of the world have contributed a greater amount to the climate crisis, and we demand that they are held responsible for their actions against the environment. While it is true that the rate of emission of developing countries, such as ourselves, are growing at a faster rate than those of developed countries, their emissions per person are much higher than ours. For example, the US CO2 emissions per person are 19.78, whereas Brazil is 2.01. Due to this, we believe we should be entitled to at least 50 to 60 billion per year of the $100 billion fund. As you can see from our seats, we are pretty poor. While it is a significant amount, we are the majority power in South and Latin America. This means we have a majority impact on the entire continent and its climate change policies. To make a significant difference, we need a large amount of monetary relief to effectively restructure not only Brazil, but all of Latin America's infrastructure to combat climate change and to help stop deforestation and contribute to reforestation. As one of the more underdeveloped countries that has a major influence on an entire continent, we will need the funds to support our changing infrastructure to help climate emissions and save our forests.
We, Brazil, and the other developing countries of the world are dedicated to combating climate change through the reduction of carbon emissions as well as the prevention of deforestation. However, given that we do not have the financial funds to carry out these plans, we ask the developed countries around the world to support us through sufficient funds to initiate the restoration of our environment. Thank you.
Delegates, and just like your colleagues from the other countries, I ask you to fulfill this form in order to summarize your national economic contribution. Thank you so much for your speech. Now it's time for the Republic of India to come here and share their national economic contribution. Please, Indian delegates, come.
Good afternoon, fellow delegates. It was a pleasure being here with all of you and having an opportunity to discuss the utmost urgent issue currently facing our world. Our nation of India has always been a loud voice at the forefront of environmental protection. We have a culture that cherishes nature and a legacy of political support for conservation that can be traced back to our Charter for the Land of B.B. Bora back in 1973. While our dedication to protect our environment is proven through our past, we are now facing new challenges with our fight against climate change and adapting to new restrictions set in place by the United Nations. As we as a nation continue to rapidly develop, it is important to remember that already developed nations, such as the United States, China, and those in the European Union, have already polluted heavily and continue to do so in order to achieve the economic success they're experiencing today. Our country's standard of living is dramatically worse than the majority of the countries present today, and thus we must fight for our citizens' right to live safely and comfortably. India deserves a fair chance at offering a higher standard of living for our citizens, and inherently it means relying on more unsustainable energy sources for the time being. With this being said, we are open to exploring more sustainable options if given the proper funding to do so. Out of the $100 billion in the United Nations Fund, it is apparent that we, as one of the largest and most prominent developing countries, will require the most funding to help build new infrastructure. I will now give the floor to Maddie to explain our public's opinion on these issues.
Regarding our stance on climate change action, our people want to live in a healthy environment, but India's prime political focus is on increasing our people's standard of living and combating poverty by gearing our resources towards bettering our employment opportunities and providing decent jobs, our housing, healthcare, mobility, and national security as well. Quite frankly, India's standard of living is far less than that of developed nations, even China. The GDP per person in India in 2018 is significantly lower than countries such as the US, EU, China, and other developed and still developing countries. In this category, India's GDP per capita landed around $6,500, a staggering low compared to the US at $61,460, or even developing nations at $10,305. Overall, India lacks the funds to adequately address these climate change issues and simultaneously overcome poverty within our own country. Despite this discrepancy between GDPs, we still want to emphasize our willingness to make commitments to environmental progress alongside these countries. We want to make progress and create a healthy environment within India and the rest of the world. But ultimately, our top priority is still raising the standard of living for our people first and foremost.
One important thing for us to note is that deforestation and land degradation present a vital opportunity to reduce emissions. Most of the world's remaining tropical forests are in developing nations like ours, where there is still a substantial amount of deforestation occurring. India has, as we said, a long history of grassroots environmental movements led by groups to protect local populations of forests. However, the movements have had a minimal effect in the long run. We want to protect our forests to reduce global emissions, but we will need the help of wealthy, developed nations to pay for these programs. India cannot sit by and let its natural resources go to waste, while developed nations who used to practice the same type of environmental destruction simply watch it happen. India is committed to protecting its forests and establishing programs to do so, but we must be subsidized by wealthy nations and not have it be thrown at our feet alone.
In 2015, India pledged to the UN to increase our carbon-free power capacity to 40% by 2030, relying on and assuming international help. We are still committed to this pledge, but we are still concerned about pressure to implement climate change reform given our need to raise a significant population out of poverty. We feel that it is not fair for India to be asked to think about environmental concerns when those asking us to do so not only polluted more than us historically, but also pollute more than we do today. India needs the help of these rich nations if it is going to reduce emissions by any meaningful amount. As a still developing country, we prioritize and defend our right to develop and lift our people out of poverty. It is unfair for India to be burdened with environmental concerns that other wealthy states like the US, China, and the EU all ignored when they were developing. We would like to commit to reducing deforestation and our emissions in our country, but we desperately need the assistance of these already developed wealthy countries to help us.
We are aware that some of the developed nations will try to pressure us to reduce our emissions because of our large population and our growing economy and our growing carbon emissions. But it's important to remember that within the global landscape, the emissions per capita in these other developed nations are far higher than those in India. For example, the United States emissions per capita is an astonishing 8 times higher than ours is. Furthermore, importantly, the cumulative emissions of India from 1850 to the present day are significantly lower than any other single group represented in this room. Therefore, any agreement that would put an unfair burden of limiting climate change on India is simply unacceptable. This is indeed a global problem, but not one that India is responsible for creating whatsoever. It is not fair for the Republic of India to foot the bill. There is even a chance that some developed nations are threatened by the rapid economic development that we are now finally beginning to enjoy. We believe that they may use a global climate agreement to slow our growth, to limit the markets that we may find for our products, and perhaps even to restrain our finally growing diplomatic and military influence around the world. We know that many other wealthy states, some of whom may be represented here, do not want to see a strong India, just as our former colonial leaders wanted to keep us weak. Therefore, we refuse to agree to any environmental pledge or agreement that we believe will slow or stop the forward progress of India and its commitment to the welfare of its citizens, who deserve to be lifted out of poverty after so long. Furthermore, the developed nations of the world who created this climate crisis must take full responsibility for their past actions. Those other nations used fossil fuels to build their economies and to enrich their populations, in some cases by stealing and exploiting India's natural resources. Now, these developed nations demand that we cut down our own emissions before our people have the chance to enjoy the economic development enjoyed in the West and in their countries, while many Indians still live in desperate poverty.
The Republic of India looks to further our work towards an environment and economy that increases our citizens' quality of life. We will strive to increase our use of clean energy sources while continuing our long-held practice of reducing our spillover impact onto other countries. Emissions are expected to peak in 2060 and decline by 2070 at a rate of 2.5% annually. While this timeline may seem in the distant future, it is important to realize that the developed countries present at this meeting have polluted for hundreds of years without any restriction. It was only until recently that our economy has grown exponentially, and by putting unfair regulations on our nation, it would jeopardize the livelihood of close to 1.5 billion people. India's grassroots movements have been led by our citizens to protect the trees on our land. However, outside interests and foreign stakeholders have time and time again chosen profit over protection of our natural resources. We would like to commit to the reduction of deforestation within our country. However, this cannot be achieved without adequate funding from outside nations. We aren't going to do any of this without necessary, adequate funding from the high-income countries that have in the past profited off the destruction of our planet. India has the most emissions of any developing nation and therefore requires the most funds to reduce our emissions. We also have the largest population in comparison to our GDP. Thus, it is vital that we receive a majority of the funding in order to ensure the safety of our people. With this in mind, we request $65 billion to meet our goals to improve the environment and quality of life, not only for the citizens of the Republic of India, but to improve the lives of those around the world. In conclusion, our nation has had a long-standing, deeply rooted, positive relationship with the environment. For decades, we have prioritized the protection of natural resources through locally led campaigns, adaptive legislation, and development goals. We maintain a cordial relationship with the environment while prioritizing the safe and equitable standard of living for our populations by building upon strong foundations for environmental, social, and economic sustainability. As a continuously developing nation, we will focus on lifting our nation's people out of poverty while starting to explore and implement renewable energy sources into our current infrastructure. Looking at developed nations such as the United States, China, and those in the European Union, we would like to emphasize our willingness to make commitments alongside theirs, even though there is a discrepancy within the GDP per capita between these nations and ours. We look forward to continuing our commitment to eliminate our spillover effort, reduce deforestation, promote grassroots environmental movements, and reduce our overall greenhouse gas emissions through initiatives that are funded externally. Thank you.
Thank you, Indian delegates. To you two, I ask you to fulfill this form. Now, last but absolutely not least, delegates from Republic of Australia and members of the Commonwealth of Nations. These foreign delegates come from the leader's speech.
last but certainly not least, the PR.
To begin, I'd like to say thank you everyone for holding this accord. It's been so far very beneficial. I'm hoping at the very end we can all agree on a couple important matters. To start, over the last decade, we have felt the effects of climate change all throughout our country. We have suffered coastal floodings, the loss of land through coastal erosion, and within the next 80 years, we will lose 80% of our beaches following the new report that came out yesterday. In addition, we have had massive wildfires that within the 2019 to 2020 bushfire season alone burned 18 million hectares, which is roughly 44 million acres of land. In addition to that, we lost 5,900 buildings, including 2,800 homes. Even worse, we had suffered countless lives lost to these fires, along with millions of animals that have been reported to be killed due to these fires. These disasters are all fueled by climate change. If significant changes can't be agreed upon in this accord, our nation will continue to burn at an increased rate due to the bushfires that are at a direct correlation to the droughts and increased global temperatures that we are experiencing all around the world. We are a developed country, home to 25 million people, with a GDP in 2021 of $1.55 trillion US. We are currently using $25 billion of our budget to fund clean energy projects and renewable projects as well. We acknowledge that the economy plays a major role in everything we do, but as leaders, role models, and representatives of our nations, we must focus on the health of our globe before we face events like we are facing currently that topple both our economies but our nation as a whole. As showcased on the fact sheet that you should be acquired, our nation is suffering the side effects of climate change, while at the same time we are steadily decreasing our national quarterly emissions by 25% from the very day of the first day of 2005. We have reduced our emissions at a faster rate than any similarly developed country, and hope that the nations in this accord follow pace in our pursuit to lower global emissions.
So keeping with that, with the goal of sustaining our global health for years to come, we've implemented several laws, procedures, and regulations of our own. For example, the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act of 1999, otherwise known as the EPBC Act, is the current national environmental law. This act makes it an offense for any person to take an action that will have significant impact on any of the following protected matters: wetlands of international importance, listed threatened species and ecological communities, Commonwealth marine areas, the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, and nuclear actions, which includes uranium mines. Additionally, to showcase our slight success, we are currently ranked 38th out of 163 for the SDG Index, which is otherwise known as the Sustainable Development Report. In addition to that mark, we're striving to do even better. It's our goal as a nation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 43% below 2005 levels by 2030. To offer some context and transparency, our current energy usage is as follows. Fossil fuels contributed 71% of total electricity generation in 2021, including coal, which is 51%, gas 18%, and oil at 2%. Then renewables contributed 29% of total electricity generation in 2021, specifically solar at 12%, wind 10%, and hydro at 6%. The share of renewable energy generation increased from 24% in 2020, and we have plans to keep this increase going. From here, we plan to invest $20 billion to rebuild and modernize our electricity network via our new Rewiring National Plan.
So reducing greenhouse gas emissions is crucial to combat climate change, and we are pledging a specific target of reducing CO2 emissions from fossil fuel combustion cement production by 43% below our 2005 levels by 2030 and achieving net zero emissions by 2050 in alliance with the Paris Agreement. To reach this goal, a range of strategies will be necessary, including reducing the use of non-renewable fossil fuels in mining and other industries, as well as transitioning to renewable energy sources such as solar and wind power. Investment in lower emissions transportation, such as electric vehicles and public transit, will also help reduce emissions. We plan to follow the National Electric Vehicle Strategy, which includes encouraging a rapid increase of electric vehicles in Australia by making them more accessible and affordable, along with establishing and supporting the infrastructure to support electric vehicle use, and establishing a $500 million Driving the Nation Fund. Another potential strategy is to implement energy districts, which are communities that are powered by shared renewable energy sources such as solar or wind power. This approach not only reduces emissions, but can also create jobs, improve public health by reducing air pollution, and increase energy security by reducing reliance on fossil fuels. Additionally, ongoing monitoring and evaluation of progress towards the emissions reduction target can help identify areas for improvement and ensure that the plan remains on track.
So talk a little bit about deforestation. Forests are acting as carbon sinks, absorbing roughly 2 billion tons of carbon dioxide each year. Deforestation is a growing problem that is contributing to an increase in greenhouse emissions, habitat loss, wildlife extinction, and loss of biodiversity. Australia as a whole has a well-established institutional framework to support the conservation and sustainable management of forests. But in order for us to continue helping to contribute to the UN's goal of a 3% increase of forest cover worldwide, there must be stricter laws limiting or prohibiting the clearing of trees, especially given that 5.5% of Australia's land is tree cover. Also supporting the UN's goals, Australia must promote the implementation of sustainable management of all types of forests, halt deforestation, restore degraded forests, and substantially increase afforestation and reforestation. This problem will not be solved by Australia alone, and we encourage other developed countries to implement laws and regulations with the same goals in mind.
So in regards to our contributions to the Global Climate Fund to support developing countries, in the Cop26 convention in 2021, we pledged $1.5 billion to reduce emissions and adapt to climate change. However, since the GDP of Australia has increased over the last years, and in this coming year, we hope to pledge an additional $500 million to the Global Climate Fund to support these developing nations. We hope that if the other 10 developed countries follow a similar amount of around $2 billion, that there will be $22 billion of the $100 billion goal covered by the developed nations. We believe that nations such as the US and China should be contributing a more significant portion of this fund as they are producing emissions at higher individual rates. So in conclusion, although much of this has been specifically focused on our country of Australia, we are calling on the other developed countries to follow our lead. We hope that Canada will rejoin the current climate agreement as they pulled out from the previous Kyoto Protocol. And as a nation, we also pledge to reinstate our carbon tax policy just as long as the other world nations can agree to significant action and international agreement. Otherwise, there will be no incentive for us to change our habits as we are not the #1 emitters and we have been steadily decreasing our emission rates year after year. That's it.
Delegates, for you two task to fulfill these, and in a couple of minutes when our Australian fellows will have finished, to complete the form, I ask you one delegate from each group to come to me and bring to me and give me the form with your national determined contribution, so that on Thursday we could resume the session with a commitment by the international scientific community to run a simulation from your first proposals. In the meanwhile, though, there is something that I have to tell you, because the Security Service for the United Nations just has informed us that for the next Thursday, an international protest is planned, and we cannot guarantee about the composition of protesters. And at the same time, we have received several requests by journalists in order to know if we meaning you want to anticipate the results, the partial results of these negotiations. So I ask you, with our doors still closed, I'm sure you, I guarantee to you that I will do anything that I can in order to maintain this information secret. What is your opinion about it? Do you want us to reveal, to leak the information about the work so far? European Union, what do you think about this? Should we communicate to the journalists and to the lay public the partial results of this meeting or not?
Yeah, we're in favor of it.
European Union say yes. So, United States of America, yes. Australia, yes. India, China, no. Brazil, yeah. Okay, thank you so much. We will decide on no other unanimity, but with a majority of votes. So the resolution is to communicate partially, but China is free to ask us. Delegates, please. China is free to ask us not reveal your. What do you want to do? You prefer to take this for you?
Disclose the information.
Disclose or not? Disclose. Okay. Thank you so much.
Don't tell.
Sorry. I'm still a human secretary, but I can tell you. Guys, thank you so much for everything. We resume on Thursday, 12:30 p.m. Thank you so much, and take a first applause.